changed my question now. I think I have a question for you, Anna.
Oh, God, you're making us nervous.
We're live now, and it's 8 o'clock.
Are we live?
I think yes.
Okay.
I think I'll just get started with the session while people slowly log on and begin to join us. We'll give it a few more minutes. Wonderful. So just to start off our session this evening, I'd like to welcome everyone that's tuning in and welcome everyone that's listening in from the UK, those that are listening in from Fiji. Thank you for taking the time to join us, and to also welcome our wonderful panelists back on the session for the fourth session of the Intergenerational Dialogue Cultural Resilience series. So I'm Philo, and I'm a member of the Marama Alliance UK. I'm a committee member, and I'll also be moderating tonight's session. Just before we move on to a brief summary of the series so far, just two housekeeping notes to be mindful of for both the listeners as well as participants, is that we try to be kind in our comments and questions and feedback. And also just a note that we will be discussing or having this conversation in the English language, and where relevant to the panelists and where they choose to, they can speak in the vernacular if needed, but we'll be communicating in the English language for the purpose of accessibility for us as panelists. Binaka, moving on to just a brief summary of the series. This would be the fourth session in the series so far, and it began in the September, around the 8th of September is when we had the first session. So it was basically an initiative to try and get Fijians in the UK of different generations to sit and talk and share ideas and maybe get a better understanding from each other's different points of views. And there have been 3 sessions so far. The first one was by group 1, and they were the 18 to 29-year-olds. And then the second session was by group 2, who were the 30 to 49-year-olds. And the last one was group 3, who were the over 50s. We then took a break last week just take a breather and go back to the drawing board before this session. So the final 2 sessions have been divvied up according to 2 main themes that came out of the last 3 discussions. And that was language and duality. So this first session is basically the first of the actual intergenerational dialogue, where we have members from the different generations sitting together to have a conversation with each other. And the second one will be next week, and the focus of that conversation will be on duality. So in terms of cultural resilience, throughout the series, we have basically been using a definition along the lines of that cultural resilience is the ability of a cultural system consisting of cultural processes in communities like ours, like the Fijians in the UK, to absorb adversity, deal with change, and continue to develop. So as a community, as members of the Rotuman community, members of the community of Fijians of Indian descent, for Asisi Tauke's, really thinking about our ability to deal with the change of having moved and settled in the UK and moving within a greater UK context and culture, and being able to be resilient in maintaining our own native cultural systems. So that is the definition of cultural resilience that we are looking at throughout the series. For tonight's session in particular, we'll be looking at language and the role that plays in cultural resilience, whether it can help or hinder cultural resilience. So that's a brief summary of the series so far. I'm now going to briefly introduce the panelists before they tell you more about themselves. So tonight we have from group 1, Tiko Seru and Peniasi Rokobuli. From group 2, we have Salote Sauturaga and Luisa Matatolu. And group 3, we have Harvey and Sosiceni. We'd also like to acknowledge Ratu Glenville Lalambalavu, who was initially supposed to be part of this group discussion, and he really wanted to, but he was unable to join us because of commitments to work. So we send him our regards and our thanks for his assistance so far. So I'll now ask the panelists to introduce yourselves. If we could start with group 1, group 2, and then ending with group 3.
Should I start?
Grazie.
Buluminaka na dango Tiko Seru au ngone leo ni nambai tavo na itasiri vasui na kilang kambara lau. I'm 23 years old. I moved to the UK when I was 6 years old. So I've lived here for quite a while. Yeah. And I live in Cornwall. I'm based in Cornwall. I've lived in Cornwall since I moved here. I've not moved anywhere else, and I don't want to.
Okay. Isang buluvinaka na tango Peniasi Rokobuli. Nangu koro saulo nambua. Vasu Samoa. I'm 19 years old, and I've lived in Ipswich for I think 5 or 6 years now. I was originally born in Fiji, but moved over in 2003-4 with my dad as he was in the army. And first originally was there in Reading, and then we were based finally in Ipswich or Watcham, yeah, just outside of Ipswich, and we've been here ever since. So that's me.
Naka Peniasi, can we have Lote, please?
Filomena Tuivanualevu Salote, Sauturaga, ngone leo ni somakia, tikinan Rokobuli, nesara ni tasiri, au vasui kumi verata teilevu. Samai au batik tukistok, singai tulungan emak nunggu meeting gue in the UK. Naka.
Naka Lote.
Buluvinaka na tango Luisa Matatolu, au daputu mai na ianu vivia, no kukoro tarukua, wea na Sauturaga lau. Au vasu I tonga matanisinga. Au wakitiki sarungo e Inverness I Scotland. Au toki mai na UK na mbaki Ronandolu tinkarua. Naka.
Naka Luisa, can we please start with Sosi?
Io dolovina neadangu o Sosiceni Tukandra, Maina Langamba, Vasui Choma Kandavu, Welsh born and bred. My parents came to the UK in 1960 as independents, so they both came not as part of the 2 and 2, but came here for work, and they settled in Wales, originally in London, but then in Wales in 1968, and I've been in Wales ever since, born and bred, and I'm the first Fijian born and bred in Wales. Yeah, so Prince Charles, sorry. Prince of Wales.
Naka, Prince of Wales. Ni naka na yabango ana kamakorewa. Harvey. Waya na datu mai na koro bunuku na sanoreo. Au vasu I mbao yanu matangali busaratu. Oyao se oyao tamai na unongo obso ni setio saru sana boston da ko pertania mera ron ni ra tortalanga werna sengani boston na bosa. I came to the UK in 1990 and I was married to a British diplomat, and we came to live in London, and we've had postings in Brussels and Kenya, and my husband at the time also had postings which I didn't accompany him to. He served in Iraq and in the Congo. And I worked for British Airways for a while. And then I went on to study law. And I graduated when I was 40. And I went back to Fiji. I went to work and lived there. And now I work as a consultant with the UN, and I live in Nottingham in the Midlands, Vinaka.
Vinaka Anna. Vinaka to all you panelists for introducing yourselves. It's wonderful to see the diversity as well in this group tonight, and we look forward to the discussions. As you would know, this week we are celebrating Fijian Language Week with the theme Nonguvosa Nonguise Mambula. So it's been quite timely as well to have this discussion with a focus on language tonight. And just before we go on to the discussion amongst the panelists, I'll just go through some key points about language that were brought up during the discussions by the three generations that took part in the previous sessions. And these included points raised about parents bringing up children in the UK, that it's important that you teach them the language and that they'll appreciate it later. Another point that was brought up was that teaching children in the UK the language is not as easy as we may think, because at one hand you have people that are relocating into another culture and trying to learn that culture, and then being expected to still teach, your native culture to children is not an easy thing to do. So that was brought up as well. Another point was that language is key in us teaching and learning the culture of our community. And another point still was that there can be a lot of shaming and shunning of people from learning more about the culture when they don't know the language. So when people are made fun of, or their attempts at speaking the language isn't correct, so to speak, there can be a lot of shaming that happens, which often discourages people from trying to learn the language or the culture more, or even take part in the community. And the last two ones that I'd like to highlight, one is that language is one aspect of our culture, that it is not the only one, and that there are other cultural practices and principles that are just as important. And then the last point is that it's not too late to try and pick up the language, and that there are resources available to help, and that for us, the rest of the community, that we support anyone who is trying to do this as much as possible. So those are just some key points to set up the discussion. And for the listeners that are tuning in, prior to this discussion, the panelists were asked to come prepared with one question for someone from a different generation. So we're going to move into those questions now. And if we could begin with the Prince of Wales, Sosi, can we have your question first?
So I suppose my first question would be to group one, and that would be, do you feel pressured, or do you feel a lot of pressure in having to learn Fijian? Yeah, do you feel the pressure? Or into it?
I think in terms of going back home to the home village, there is a slight pressure there, because you get that sense of, that will they, appreciate it if I don't know the language, or will they understand me? That's a big thing. But on a general basis, the language, it's more of a, it'll make things easier. Like, for example, if I was to see a Fijian in public and then they introduce themselves in Fijian, I could then respond back, but then to hold the conversation to go on longer, it's a whole nother story, because then I'm then stuck trying to recalculate my head, what do I say in Fijian to make him understand? And, it's just that sense of unknowingness, and, like, is he going to understand me? And I know he won't understand me if I respond back in English and things like that. So, yeah, I'd say so. It is, I do want to learn it, yeah.
For me, I I didn't feel any pressure because I knew how to speak in Fijian when I came to England. And I think it was kind of like the opposite. When I went back to Fiji in 2008, I was kind of, they expected me to speak in English to them. But because I still knew how to speak in Fijian, and when we met them, they were like, "Hello, how are you?" We just responded in Fijian, and they're like, "Oh, you still know how to speak Fijian." So like, I didn't feel any pressure at all. Because I knew the language. But I think if I didn't, I think I would have, like Peniasi said, it would have been quite difficult for me if I didn't know the language.
Naka, Sosi, Peniasi, and Tiko.
Naka.
I wonder if it was the same experience from everyone else in the group. Is there a lot of pressure for you to learn it, or do you have a lot of expectation for other Fijians to know the language? Maybe we could start with group 2, Lote and Luisa.
I've not had to sort of feel pressure to learn Fijian, and I think it's because it was my first language and I've always kept it throughout. But to put myself in the shoes of Peniasi, to switch it from the other way around, from my Vasu. When we moved, this is for quite some years, I was kind of annoyed with my mother for not teaching us Tongan. And it wouldn't have, like, if we had lived in Fiji, it would have been fine. It would not have mattered to me, because I stayed in Fiji, I spoke Fijian, which was fine. Like, Fiji, we speak Fijian. But she took us to Tonga, and we didn't know the language. Like, we hadn't been taught it. So, and then we had to go and live there. And so, like, there's a lot of pressure for us. We are nanongu rai, we tonongu vasu, na do sarana kami ver to norto wasa ke kai ko sini bosa tonga iko sanga ni kai tonga dina. That's the impression that I got. So that was kind of like the pressure that I felt, which like it made me feel like an outsider for a number of years until I learned. And it was harder for me. I was 16 at the time. My brothers were easier. They were, much younger. So I kind of like can see if that had happened to me the other way around, I would probably feel it that way. Like that's kind of like the parallel that I can come from. But for Fijian, I know, like, and it's like it's a really nice thing for me. When I go home to Fiji and I just hear the language being spoken, like as soon as I get even into the Fiji Airways plane, so it connects me to my home and my culture, everything about my identity as well. Yeah, that's just from my perspective personally.
I was never pressured as well because I grew up speaking my own dialect. While I understand, like living in the UK, there are lots of people who don't speak Fijian as their first language anymore. And I understand Fijian families, Itoke families raising their children not speaking Fijian entirely. There's always mixed of English and Fijian within the family, even family dialogue. But in my own personal, like in my family, I would rather teach my nephews, teach my cousins, or encourage them to speak in Fijian. I think one of the points that Philo mentioned earlier about what was discussed from the previous sessions is language is not the only thing about our culture, that there are other things like behaviors and that all come together as our culture, and language is not the only thing. I don't entirely agree with it, but I think language is the key player in our culture, because when we start to lose our language, or when we start to lose our dialect, that everything has to be refashioned in, you know, in a new language with different words, different sounds, different behavior, you know. So the tradition that has been kept all along, it will then start to get lost in the process, and then it'll be replaced by the new culture, the new habits that have been brought in or now being spoken by the new group of people that are, you know, speaking now in Fijian now. So our language that we know of now, if it's not continued, then even our own behaviors and you know, the little etiquettes that we do, all those things can be lost as well, because we've lost the main language that we communicated, because it's not just through words, it's through the behavior. So in my own personal environment, within my family, I very much encourage my family, my relatives to speak and to be proud of speaking in our dialects. Thank you.
Okay.
Naka Lote. Anna, did you have anything to add before we move on to the next
Yeah, no,
question?
I just wanted to touch on what Lote's just said. I think maybe there is quite, I mean, there's an issue here that we have to kind of make a distinction between language and dialects, because, you know, we have a Fijian language. What is the Fijian language to us? And who, you know, do we identify as the Mbawan dialect to be the Fijian language? Or, you know, or is it your own dialect as the Fijian language? So when you talk about culture, you know, we have very diverse cultures. We come from very diverse cultures. There are different ways in how we do things. You know, those people from Metasiri, from Pandavu, from, you know, there's similarities, but they're very different. The dialects, the Nandronga people, they do things differently. And so in terms of culture, you know, culture is the practices and things like that that you do. You know, it includes protocols and all these kind of things. And when you talk about culture, you're talking about the, you know, it can include the language they speak, for example, because I think Nandronga dialect, you know, I think it's a completely whole language to me. I can't even understand when they sit and talk. So that to me is a language. So if you have to qualify it as a language. So I think, yeah, you have to make this distinction first. You know, what is it that we regard as a language? And then also, why do we use language? You know, we use language to communicate. So communication is why language is started. It's what they identify, you know, a group of people identify and they talk so that they can communicate with each other. And so in respect of that, we shouldn't really, for me, in my humble opinion, I think it's very dangerous to take just, you know, and call it a language, however you define it, and pin it onto an identity of a culture of a person, especially in the diaspora community here in the UK. You know, we've got so many Fijians from different backgrounds in Fiji, different, you know, diverse places we come from. And so when we come here and we try and put this, you know, and we say, oh, you don't speak in Fijian, what does that mean? Does that mean that you don't speak in Kandawa or Mbawan, or, you know? So I think this actually, for me, I would leave it to culture and heritage experts to kind of give their insight on this. And really, like I've always said, language of love is the important thing for us.
Naka Anna, you know, judging from or listening into all your contributions tonight, it also made me think about language in not just the verbal sense of it. For us as Itaukei people, there's also a very big aspect of communication for us that's not verbal. Like silence could mean a whole lot of different things in the different spaces you put yourself in, or the absence of your presence could also mean a whole lot of, it's communicating a whole lot of different things to the people that it's intended for. So I guess it can be quite holistic as well. We'll now move on to the second question. And if we could have Luisa, if you could ask your question next.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, there's like a little box in front of me. Right. My question was also to our first panel, to group one. When you're talking about like when we're talking about language, like to me, just coming from Anna's point as well, is like speaking in Fijian for me means speaking the standard Fijian or your dialect. To me, that's all just speaking in Fijian. Because to me, the beauty of it is just knowing, like one of the many Fijian languages that we have. I usually call them languages as opposed to dialects. For our group one, how do you see possibly the word that is being used at the moment, Madani was is wakambulumbula, which means to like I don't really want to say revive because it's not dying, but like to keep it alive, I guess. The language, like how do you see that happening for your generation, like from us, the older ones? Like,
I think like the experience Tiko had, like growing up being taught it, it's a whole lot different being born in England and then taught the language. Like, for example, me being born in Fiji and then taught the language there, it was a whole lot different because that's all I knew. I never knew English until I came to England. And then when I was starting going to school in England, then the language was just kind of not shied away, but thrown back to the back of my head. And I never spoke it again. But until it was spoken at home, then I can understand it. But as I said earlier, I couldn't respond back because I didn't know much of it. And the way I think we could keep it alive is, for example, yes, keep it within the household and, teach them as they grow up, but also really take them back to the, where the parents are from, where the relatives are from, because that way I think, like my dad told me, if, we're going back to Fiji next year, and if you know where you're from in Fiji, then you'll be well-grounded wherever you go in the world. And that's one statement that really, I really got to think, that's really true, because no matter who you are, where you're from, if you can, give a good backstory on who you are in Fiji, or where you're from in Fiji, sorry, and back it up by saying, this is my heritage, these are my relatives that have gone before me, and relate that to now how you're trying to live that in your future life. I think that's one really good way of, keeping their language alive, because I think what Lotte said, it goes hand in hand, the language and the culture. You can't really get to know the culture if you don't know the language that much. But that's how I see it, and how I think, we could really keep the language moving.
Yeah, I completely agree with Peniasi. For me, yeah, I was taught to speak my language at home. That was a rule that my dad did. I think that's the way that, his way of keeping it alive for us, having to speak it all the time in the house and when we're around other Fijians. Even when we're around Fijians without our parents, we still spoke to them in Fijian, even though when they speak to us in English, we'd still respond in Fijian. I think that's a way of us keeping it alive. And sometimes we would play this game where you can't speak in English, you have to speak in Fijian, and if you speak an English word, or if you speak in English, then you'll face a consequence or something. That was a way of us, me and my siblings, that's a way of us keeping the language alive, and helping other people, other Fijians to speak the language. I think just continuing to speak the language, teaching especially for the parents, help your kids, your children to speak the language. I think also if they're willing to learn the language, that will help. But if they're not willing, then I don't know, it's going to be difficult. Like for my little sister, I tried to help her speak the language, but she just doesn't want to learn at the moment. Maybe later on in life, but right now she's just full straight English, no Fijian.
Naka Tiko and Peniasi.
Naka Tiko and Peniasi for your answers, which have been very enlightening. And just bringing home the point that you mentioned, Tiko, about where it has worked for you, where your dad put in place those measures where you could only speak Fijian at home and at certain times. And I think it came up in one of the discussions in the previous group's sessions, was when we had to learn how to speak English. Those measures were also put in place, but in the reverse, we could only speak English. We weren't allowed to speak our language or dialect, so that we could, learn this new language. So maybe the reverse of that is needed as well, in keeping our language and dialects alive, as well as making it fun in the games like Tiko's dad did for them. So thank you very much for that. We'll now move on to the next question, and thank you very much to you panelists it's been wonderful to see the dialogue across generations, and we look forward to the rest of it. So for the next question, can we please have yours, Peniasi?
Yes, so mine is more towards, I'd say group 3, but it's in general for 2 and 3. Obviously, the culture is something we've mentioned, and it's a big thing in, the youth, I think, to, really get to know the culture and how we operate as a community in Fiji. Is there any point in your upbringing where you thought that, in the UK, or any point in the UK, sorry, that in your upbringing you thought this is like a cultural shock, now living in the UK? Did you see the difference in the way you lived in Fiji compared to here? Was it a shock to you?
Yeah, I can start with answering that question. I suppose for me it was because I came in the 90s, and when you probably weren't born then. When I came, there was a very small group of Fijians that existed in the UK at the time, and most of them were people that came in the 60s to join the army, and their children, and people like Sosi's parents. And so that was our community. So a lot of them had spoken English anyway. So there was no Fijian kind of dialogue in a lot of places that we go to socialize with other Fijians. So I suppose the culture shock that I'm getting now is the reverse, because when I go home, because I think it's about diaspora communities. When you go, because I've been, and I think when I was in Kenya, I had a discussion with this lady from the Indian embassy, and she said to me that she was shocked at how the Indian diaspora in Kenya were preserving the culture, and the way they were doing it was so much more archaic. in terms of what was going on, the real-time India in Bombay and Delhi and all those places. So I suppose for me it was like that, because when I went to Fiji and lived there for 4 years, from 2012 to 11 to 2015, I came back here, and what I saw was like in Suva, they've kind of, you really don't see a lot of cultural, you see people in chamba and, all this, the dress, but people spoke in English all the time. A lot of people, they spoke English. There's no, and I suppose we were there, but coming here, it was almost like to the extreme how we were doing things. And there was almost like a little bit confusing at times, because I didn't know my place in some of the Fijian things that I go to, because we don't do that when I'm in Suva. But I know what it's like when I go to my own village, or when I go to my mother's village. I know the protocols, I know what to do. But here there was an extreme kind of, it was so it in a way it used to I kind of avoided going to some Fijian tours because I didn't know my place in it. So I suppose that was the shock for me, the actual reverse, that we take to the extreme here. And in Fiji, it's a bit more lax, unless you go home to because you've got your own kind of, your own people, your own culture. From my Rewa side, I know what to do when I go there. And my Bowen side, I know what to do and where to go, and those protocols and whatever. So yeah, that's probably how I'd answer that question.
Yeah, so you say like it's kind of, the culture here is now resembled back home in Fiji in some places. So like it's kind of westernized, I would say, kind of like it's kind of adapting to the change in the speed we're moving things, essentially.
Yeah, I think we, like, for example, if I go into like a get together in Suva, like Fijian gathering, like in the village is different if I go to the village, but in Suva, for example, yeah, because I'm talking about England now, but when I'm in Suva, we don't do all these protocols, these things that we do when we're here, like here, some of the Fijian does, they do things like, I find myself out of place in it because I don't know what kind of, the protocols that they're doing and where it's from. I'm a bit strange to it at times. So that's probably the shock that do I make sense?
Yeah.
So I suppose it's the communities here, when we get together, like to mix together, it's all these different things coming together, and you're trying to identify a common, kind of cultural or traditional practice or protocol to kind of agree on, and to, and usually it's the host, but when you go to the embassy dues or to, those kind of things, it's very, it can be very confusing for me.
I agree with what Anna is saying. It can be confusing because there are many of us from different provinces coming together. So there are lots of little communities around, Fijian communities around the UK. So I think it all comes down to what they agree on, how they want to, carry out certain functions within their own communities. I think that comes down to them and how they want to do it. But obviously for some of us, like Anna has mentioned, it can be confusing because you see it done in different ways from how you were brought up and comparing it to Fiji. For me, personally, things that I've experienced here haven't been a shock to me, because well, I've traveled as well, so I don't tend to judge certain things too quickly, especially when it comes to the Fijian community and the things that they do. But I will act the way I am brought up, within my family, from my own village. I will act that out because that is what is familiar to me. And if I don't know a certain cultural itobo or I will not do it because I'm not familiar with it and I don't want to offend anyone else.
Yeah.
So I will always do or act the way I am brought up and the way I have been taught from within my own village and my own family. But I also understand that other people will also always probably doing the same thing anyway, yeah? Because we will always show how we are brought up and, you know, your own tradition, your own culture from your province, etc. So there's when we come together as a community, I think that's where we will have to make compromises and share and agree on what we want to go ahead with. But I think for the elders within the community, especially within the UK, the Fijian community, I think it is their responsibility to advise the young, you know, youths and the younger generation that are always involved, to advise them on, you know, what's going on, what is the agreed behavior within the community, and what is actually their own, the behavior or the culture in their own villages. I think there should be a distinction made just to lessen the confusion. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah.
You do, Lote. Would anyone else like to answer that question before we move on?
I was just going to say, I suppose I was born and bred in the UK, so I've always known a small Fijian community that was almost like everybody was related. So every Fijian you saw was either your aunt or your uncle, and even though you weren't related, you grew up in that sort of like small community that was very much a family community. Obviously, as the community has become bigger, like you said, there are different sections and different communities, different people from different provinces. So it has spread out, you know, and so seeing that cultural change within the UK, for me, being born and bred here in the UK, growing up, and seeing how, I suppose we're not as together as I've always known it to be. Even though we're all Fijians, sometimes you get these little pockets of Fijians that do other things. So it can be on a religious basis. It can be on a, you know, from where they're from in Fiji, you know. So it's seeing that we are all one, but sometimes we're not all together. So you get different pockets within the community, or different communities that will be separate, you know. With I was quite used to growing up in a community where everyone was, you know, and suddenly you're walking down the street and you're like, you know, well, you're not my auntie, well, you're not my uncle, and it's, you know, and we're not as close as I thought we would have been. So yes, so and for me, going back to Fiji and seeing the changes there, I suppose what I was saying, like, you know, when we talk about culture, growing up in the UK, I had to learn a lot of my culture by reading books. So yeah, so there was quite a shock for me when I was actually picking up books, learning about the early days of Fiji, and learning about cannibalism, and how barbaric it was in certain texts, and then suddenly realizing, you know, and saying to your mum, so does this mean then, you know, when Dad dies, I've got to strangle you and chuck you in the grave, because that was the tradition back in Fiji back in the day. So yeah, you know, just knowing that, you know, I actually come from cannibal roots was actually a shock growing up, you know. But it's something that I learned, and you know, yeah, and it's something that, you know, you were like, because where, you know, I was brought up thinking Fiji, big bullet smile, yellow sand, blue seas, but actually we were from a different culture and a different time where I suppose it was a different place, you know, and then having to learn and read. So for me, learning my culture was learning about the history of Fiji and the history of its people to where they are today. Do I make sense?
Yes, you do. Yeah. So, and it's interesting that, you know, a lot of the reading material that is available about our history is most of which are written by like visitors into Fiji, like foreigners or the colon. So I guess my point there is that we have to tread with caution as well when we read those things. And then again, because a lot of our language, our culture is passed down orally, and whether, we are doing that because really we would be linking our elders, the knowledge they've passed on to us, to the next one. I guess I'm rambling here. I'm not sure where I'm going with this. But thank you for your sharings on this question in particular. We'll now move on to the next question. And next up, we'll have your question, Lote. But before that, there's a question from the audience from Sue from France, Susanna. She's asked, Lote, if you could say a little bit in your dialect before you move to asking your question.
They what? To speak? To say anything?
Yeah. She just wants to hear you say something in your dialect.
Okay, I'll describe where my village is, in my dialect. Nangukoro somakia, tikina nandara bakawalu. Kana bo may suba, na kawanto lori, ano bo may suba me ave nakora biben done awo bi mama. Kana bukamba murma na Princess Road, bukamba, ave Sawani, pastek Sawani anda takambao school. Pastek na wabu mugobambo enda takambao pasi bukam Sara, wa ave nangali ngona odobutika na ave ni koro nangali koro wa ave bukam Sara ba mur nangon sala bawa na Wunindawa government station. Donangon sala bawa mon sabu. Donangon sala bawa na Wunindawa government station. So nungku koro ya mona mur nangon sala ko bawa Wunindawa. Ada Wunindawa abo kam Sara nangon sala bawa nambiana koro dalitonga koro. Dambe taulebu koro wasiro baltale ne ruku koro. Koro tarabo na Peniasi. Na bunona ba ave kenangon sala. Nungku koro toka tiliba. Ona ba lele ba namboto. Na ba ave sare na koro. I hope that's enough.
Not a lot there.
My question would be, we're talking about cultural resilience. Sometimes there are modern ways of doing things. I'm not saying there are better ways, but there are modern ways that could improve on certain behaviors or agreed ways of living within our own villages. This question, I guess, would be, I would direct it to group 3 again. Why is it that there's always a lot of resistance when, especially, like I've had experiences within my own village where, you have youths, you have people who go through university, tertiary, or, they hold jobs, like within the government, etc. And so they learn new ways of doing things. And sometimes if you bring those things into the village, try to as a learning experience, say for example, like workshop type events to do leadership training or time management, why is it like that there's always resistance, especially from the older generation? When I say this, because I always see that, people encourage that our children are to be preyed upon so that they can go to school and but then these same kids, when they are educated and they try and bring what they have learned to come and help us, not in a way that's forceful or say our way is right, but to try and find a common ground where we can sort of work together, or just to hear it that this is what's happening in the world outside of our village or our province. But why is it that there's always so much resistance even to youth speaking up, saying something within our own Fijian culture? Can someone explain that? Like, I'd like to hear from a perspective from someone else from group 3 or even group 1 or 2.
Oh, again, that question is very, Lotte, I think, you know, when you ask that question, I see that you presume that people in the village there's a kind of maybe rejection or resistance to new ideas that come in. Am I right to say that?
Yeah, from the experiences that I have experienced, there've always been a lot of resistance.
And to this, sorry, I'm going to be gender, you know, to clarify which gender. Do you know if it's like men or women who you had the experience with? Who was it, or is it the whole village? Elders?
I can't really say, but I would say yes, definitely people in leadership.
Yeah, so I don't
Can be
know.
both men and women, eh? Can be both men and women.
Yeah, because I can't answer for you, but I can only answer for Rewa, for example. We have a lady who is our chief, and she is very receptive to ideas, and you know, she's very engaging in what she does with the Rewan, even diasporas like me. You know, they come, you know, there are people that get in touch with us, the Rewan people that are here or overseas or at home, even in Suva. So I think maybe traditionally there's always been that, and I think I can't really answer that question because it depends on who is in leadership. It's all about leadership, really.
That's why.
So you have some bad chiefs, you have some good chiefs, and you know so it really depends who is in leadership and how receptive they are, or how they value education, how they value new ideas that won't compromise on the traditional values of the village and cultural practices, but it can bring kind of advancement in how they, you know, in their ideology or their mentality, you know, to develop and to maybe help in, you know, businesses for women. I see the Naitasiri women are they're quite big in, you know, there's a group that does the dairy, Naitasiri dairy women. I think that group is quite fascinating. And, you know, so women taking leadership there, and you know, the young people that I saw that were on the interview. So maybe it's changing. So I can't really answer as to, I can only put it to leadership. You know, it depends on the leadership, how receptive they are to other ideas. And I think there is a changing trend that's happening in Fiji now.
Yeah, I think from like my perspective, when I went to Fiji and start the year, the way all I was told, like by the family, you know, you will always love your experience in the village. And the thing is, I think the reason they, you know, why they feel so much resistance is because when you look at the world now, everything's moving so quick and everything. But in the village, you know, it's all very the typical Fijian style, how, you know, things are run, and like the proper traditional way of things going by, like, you know, how they go down to the plantation, come back, and then you share amongst everything in the village. And then it's that sense of community that, you know, really keeps everyone going. And that's the reason I think why they want to they have that resistance. Like, it's the fear of like Fiji becoming like the rest of the world, essentially. Because, you know, when I went to Fiji, it was the way I saw, like, the way the dress, even in the village, was just all the kind of stuff like I would wear on a daily basis in the house. And then, not that it was a shock or anything, but like, you know, it's just amazing to see how much Fiji is trying to keep up with the rest of the world. And, you know, like for me, my experience in the village was the best. And when I was in the city, it was very much like, I felt as if it wasn't much different to how I would be here at home in England, you know? So I think that's why there's so much resistance, the fear of, you know, becoming like everyone else, and that like Fiji trying to keep Fijians like unique, you know, and different from everyone else.
Yeah, I was wondering if we could bring the discussion into our context here as Fijians in the UK, who are trying to figure out a way of maintaining our cultural systems or our language. And, you know, just listening to your comments, it made me think of, while in Fiji, and this is a question, I think it applies to what Lote is saying, that in different spaces, there are ways and things to do things, and there are people who can speak and people who can't speak. There are people who can sit in certain places and people who can't. And here in the UK, we sort of have the privilege of not being tied down to those hierarchies, or what's the word, or structures that are quite oppressive to some extent. So we have the privilege of not being tied to those. And is it a question of whether we come and replicate that here, or do we find new ways that are not so oppressive and limiting to others?
So when you bring it here to the, what context you're saying, like, you know, when you bring it to our community level here in the UK, so are you saying that what Lotte was raising there as an issue, is that replicated here?
I guess my point was that we have the privilege of a choice whether we want to do that here or not, and that's something that should be given thought. Is that something you would like to replicate, or do we want to find new ways to do things that is quite inclusive and quite liberating for everyone?
Well, I suppose that's, we are here in a country where you are free to do what you want, really.
Exactly.
So you know, there's no one that's going to hold you down here. You know, in Fiji, we will have our elders, our village elders, who hold us accountable to, or hold us in check, you know, of how we want to do things in the village. But you know, in this context, or even in Suva, you have the liberty, really, to be innovative and to be, you know, and I think that's a very healthy thing, because you know, the societies change all the time, and we do have to appreciate that, because you know, here we are, that the very fact that we're here in the UK is because societal practices and norms have changed in Fiji. So you know, we can't be too what's the word, you know, we can't say like have our pie and eat it too, kind of thing. So we are here in the UK and we are at liberty. So you know, education is something that liberates us, liberates the mind, and it's something that also can teach us to you know, new ways of reinforcing the cultural the resilience that we need, you know, especially in the face of adversity that we face here every day. You know, if you go out to work, whether it's in the army, whether it's out there in the public places, in companies in the UK, you'll be faced by some form of discrimination, or you know, maybe you're not even aware of. But there are things like that you can, and how do you navigate yourself, you know, in this kind of places and spaces without losing your sense of identity as a Fijian? And that's the question, and that's how, you know, and one of them, like we're all talking about here, is language. And how do you do that? You know, do we teach it as a community, or do we teach it at our homes? Do we encourage people at home to start, like we've been talking about? And, you know, the dialects that you know, it's a choice, it's a matter of choice for people, and so on.
Nata Anna, on that note, can we have Tiko, your question next?
Yeah. My question is for Anna, Harvey. So I'm assuming that you did you bring your children up in the UK?
Yeah.
Was it hard? Was it hard bringing them up? Especially like are they half Fijian and half British? Yeah. What was it like, or how? Was it hard trying to teach them the Fijian language, or did you? Yeah. Was it hard to teach them the Fijian culture and language?
Okay, my kids, they're both Fijian. I met my husband as a single mother, so he adopted my children. So they are Fijian children with British. So when we came to England, Fiona spoke, Kevin wasn't really speaking much, but Fiona was fluent in her Fijian. So she was about 3 years old, and then she went into school in Brussels, at the British school in Brussels. And we were actually because I was speaking in Fijian to her all the time. And the teacher there, the head teacher, she asked me if I could speak in English, and because she wasn't communicating with other children. So I started speaking to her in English. And, you know, because we really couldn't, and the other thing is about priority. My priority at the time, you know, I was a very young mother, and I had other priorities, you know, apart from looking after my kids and whatever. That priority wasn't to teach my kids Fijian, because I just took it for granted that they will know, and they need to speak in English. So I did. And, you know, Fiona is the one, sorry, I'm mentioning her name here, but she has this, she has talked about it with me now. You know, she's 33 now. And she said to me, Mom, I wish you had spoken to me in Fiji, you know, like all the time. And I said, well, you know, I wish too, but then it's too late now, but you have the tools now. And so she's now going to, you know, it's a matter of choice for her, because I always taught her that no matter what anybody says, nobody will take away the fact that you're Fijian, you know? So to me, Fijian language is very important in terms of preserving our culture. You know, it's about cultural preservation. But there's a lot of Fijians in Fiji, and I don't think it'll die out. The language will die out, to be very honest with you. So that fear should be taken away from us, because I think, you know, to have this fear that Fijian is going to disappear. No, I don't think so. I think it's going to be there for for all our lifetime, you know. So, but the important thing is, what I taught my children is, do not, because they've been out in Fijian dues here, and they've been accused of being not Fijian because they speak in English and they don't speak in Fijian. She was so upset. One of the, you know, she doesn't like, she's very, when I go to Fijian events, I have to go with her, because she doesn't feel confident being there by herself. And I think that's really sad. And I said to her, don't ever let anyone tell you that you're not Fijian just because you don't speak in Fijian. So your identity in Fijian will always be there. Ever take that away from you. And I think she's grown with that, and you know, she integrates. She's got a, you know, she went to school here at the uni, like you, Tiko. So she's got a lot of friends, and she's very confident with herself now as a young lady who says that she's Fijian. And so the choice, however, is with her now as an adult. So she wants to learn. There are tools there, and she will learn. She said she will take the time to start learning. And I think when you're a younger child, you know, like what I did, I didn't continue to speak to her in Fijian. And I don't think that anyone should blame themselves, and parents should be you know, be almost being blamed or in some sort of way for their children not speaking in Fijian, because, you know, first of all, they're not teachers, and the other thing is they probably have other priorities which are more important than teaching Fijian. You know, they're in a country where they need to speak in English, and they, you know, for work or whatever else they do. So, you know, it's a matter of choice. So have the, you know, and we can only encourage parents that it's a good thing for that, but to just reassure their children that they'll, you know, their identity is Fijian does not sit on the fact that they speak in Fijian. Thank you.
Naka Anna, you bring up a really good point, and something that has come out in all the previous sessions as well is that, you know, there's this tendency to shame and shun people who don't know how to speak the language or the dialects as in a way of saying that you're not Fijian enough, which is quite unfortunate. And I wondered if we could give it a few moments to maybe just discuss this as a group before we move on to the last question, which will be Anna's.
Sorry, I'm back in the room. I've had a power cut. So my Wi-Fi's gone, so I'm actually sat in my car. And my phone was dying, so yeah, so apologies.
Technical difficulties.
I feel as if I am in Fiji. I should have a candle with me. So yeah, I suppose with the drift is about speaking Fijian and being shamed in not speaking Fijian, isn't it?
Yes.
So from my personal experience, you know, like I've said before, you know, I self-taught myself Fijian. I learned a lot from my parents, but I was picking up the language in the home. We were never pressured as kids to learn Fijian. A lot of it was what we picked up. And then as I got older, I then went to the village and then picked up a lot of Fijian there. But I was quite, I suppose I always heard my parents speak Bowen Fijian. And then obviously then when I went back to Fiji, to my mother's side, they would speak Bowen. And then when I went to Bar, they would all speak in the Bar dialect. And of course, you know, they would say to me in the village, can you tell that they've changed? And you'd be like, yes, because I can understand the phonetics of normal Bow Fijian. But then when you start speaking Bar dialect, it's almost like someone's had a stroke, because it's like all like slur words and stuff, you know? So I was able to pick up the difference of, you know, sort of like the dialects and stuff. But, you know, going back to the village, we were never made to feel as if, you know, bad about not speaking Fijian. But there have been times where, especially with my two sisters who've got very strong Welsh accents, speaking Fijian in a Welsh accent, they can't understand. You know, so many times, you know, I can remember before being in Fiji, and trying to speak Fijian, but then having a very strong Welsh accent, people, A, not being able to understand and not even acknowledging you, you know? So there was a lot of that in a sense, you know, because you'd say like, oh, you know, the draki here, bloody kata, isn't it? And they wouldn't understand, you know? People just wouldn't understand, you know? Whereas if I spoke, and another way in would be to speak English in a Fijian accent. So that was another way in you know, sometimes when, you know, there's a barrier there, you know, like I think Peniasi said before about sometimes you'll speak to someone in Fijian, they will respond back, and then you're like, I haven't got a clue what you've just said, but I will speak to you back in a Fijian accent, English Fijian accent, you know? Yeah, you know, so, yeah, so there are ways around it, but, you know, it's, you know, it doesn't define me, because I live in Wales and everybody here is Welsh, but none of them speak Welsh, you know? So it's not about the language, you know, and it hasn't defined me. I still understand bits of it, and I will get there one day, but, you know, it's, you know, yes.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, and I think in the last session I was in, not knowing the language doesn't necessarily make you less Fijian. It just means you have more to learn about the language, which is what I think is an exciting thing, because I'm always more willing to learn more about my culture, and more importantly, my heritage, you know, my family, and like what and who they were, you know, and like the family name. Because obviously in the, like you said, the dialects we have, you know, it's a sense of, it's more like communication in general, or the language. It's more of it's not just a means of communicating, it's also a means of making that connection with someone. And, you know, like for example, if I was to speak in me being from Vanualevu in Bua, if I was then to speak in the Nandrangan dialect, they'd be like, oh, okay, you speak Nandrangan, and then, you know the dialect and everything. We made that connection instantly, and then I could speak in the the dialect we speak in Bua. They'll realize, oh, you're from Bua, you know, you're from there, and then you got that connection instantly. And it's, you know, the language, it's different, very, I think, from all the other languages, but like I said, it doesn't have to necessarily define you as a person or who you are, especially in, like, you know, growing up, because like I said, there's more to learn if you just don't know the language.
I agree with my fellow panelists. I definitely agree with Anna about parents not blaming themselves about their children growing up not speaking Fijian. Because for me, I'm 41, and I kind of like caught on to the fact of why, like the priorities. My mother's priority at the time of not teaching us her language was because she married a Fijian, she came to Fiji, and she had to learn Fijian. So that was her priority, So for us, because we were living in Fiji, she probably didn't think it was, right. We didn't have a use for our Vasu language, so we just spoke Fijian. And for the other thing I always thought about listening to Group 1 when they had their session was, you can talk about our younger generation, or teaching Fijian to a younger generation, but they have to want to learn it. Like, again, the choice comes in there. Like, they have to want to learn it, and that's for every generation. Right up to Socis as well. They'll have to want to learn it. You can teach it, but we live in a time where there's technology that helps us connect to places where you can get the resources if that's what you want to do. So yeah, and the whole thing about shaming people or shunning them when they don't speak the language, I get, because I've seen it. I've been in those spaces as well, from either language, and I tend to speak in English most of the time, and it's because it's easier for me than from switching between my two the two vernacular languages that I speak. So I stay in English most of the time, even when I'm with my fellow Fijians or my Vastu with the Tongans, and then people, presuming that you don't speak either language as well because you're speaking in English 90% of the time. But again, those things come through, like, the blame, people shouldn't blame themselves for not teaching their children. The choice, if you want to learn, it's entirely up to you. Like, for our next generation, like Tiko was sharing about her younger sister, it might come later on, but for now, her choice is she doesn't want to learn it. So we have to be aware in sort of like that we don't, we're not forcing it, but people feel bad about not speaking their language, and then whether people are speaking standard Fijian, like standard Bowen, and then not speaking their dialect, things like that. That's just what I think about that.
Lulu. Anyone else before we move on to the last question from Anna?
I'll just add to what everyone said. In terms of the shaming thing, I think we also need to understand that Fiji has 3 official languages. English is one of them. So there's English, Itoke, and Hindustani, if I'm correct. So, but I think we always as indigenous people, Itoke, I mean, we always, when we say Fijian, we always refer it to, we always in general refer Fijian to being the Itoke language, because that's how it was initially before they changed it, I think, where now the word Fijian, it refers to everyone, and the Itoke is now for the indigenous people of Fiji. But I think we always tend to forget that the official languages are the Itoke language, the English language, and also Hindustani. So being a Fijian, you know, this doesn't just like, what I'm trying to say is, when you look at someone and you automatically see that they're Fijian, you automatically assume they speak the language, speak the Itoke language. And I was just discussing this the other day with my friend, because she runs a food business, and you know, she likes to cook Fijian dishes. So when people look at what she sells, they automatically think, when she says that she sells Fijian food, they automatically think that it's the Itoke food. So if she's selling curry, that's not Fijian to them. So they were having this discussion, and I was saying, you know, we need to remember that Fiji is a multicultural country, and it's just not only Itoke people that are living in Fiji. There are also other cultures that we have lived in the same country for a long time. So if we can just diversify our mindset a little bit more and not just restrict it to the Itoke culture, to the Itoke language, I think that would be, you know, I think that would be very helpful in terms of understanding other people. Yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Lote. It's such a good reminder and an
Yeah,
important point. Go ahead, Anna.
Sorry, yeah, I think that's an important point, because you know, when again, it's the presumption, you know, Fijians, that's part of our culture. We presume things, we assume things. And I think, you know, and that's, you know, because we're very small communities, we come from small communities. So in this context, when we are talking on this platform, you know, I think it is assumed that we, or presumed that we are talking about the Itoke culture, because, you know, like the indigenous culture. That's the presumption that we've come on, and we're probably not being made clear. But I think the way the conversation has been going, I think we all could understand that we are talking on that context, in that context, that we're talking about indigenous. But it's a very good reminder from Lotte that, you know, we should be a bit more clearer, because we are talking on a public forum.
Naka Anna, on that note, can you please ask your question?
My question really is about, I think a lot of it has been answered through these conversations, but I kind of going to pose it to the young ones. So anybody who's younger than me then. Can you, I think what it is, what do you consider as a Fijian language? It's in two parts. And how do you think, or can you explain or give reasons as to how, you know, this not speaking in Fijian can compromise on your ability to identify yourself as a Fijian? Does that make sense? So,
can you rephrase the second one, please?
Like, just explain, or in just a few words, or whatever, how you know, when you don't speak in Fijian, how can that compromise on your ability to identify yourself as a Fijian? How does that, you know, so that the not being able to speak in Fijian, like maybe Peniasi, you can start, you know, having not, if you don't speak the Itoke language fluently, How does that compromise on your ability to say for sure and confident that you are Fijian?
Yeah, see, for me, it's more like, for example, just said, like at the start when you're introducing ourselves, that's the main thing. You know, not being able to introduce in Fijian fully is one thing that can be a deterrent for me. You know, trying to explain where my dad's from, where my mum's from, you know, and the village I'm from in Fiji, or the Matangali as well. You know, because the big thing is in Fiji with the language, especially, is identifying yourself through language, and you know, making yourself aware to the person or the people you're trying to make yourself aware to. It's really trying to get that point across of, I know who I am, and I bring back the point I said earlier about being well grounded wherever you are in the world. And by going back to the home village where you're from, where your father's from, your father's village or your mum's village, it can really make that difference in, you know, your understanding of the language, especially because in Fiji, we're a very selfless culture, I'd say. Like, you know, we're very welcoming people and everything. But it's also the fact that when, say, for example, my friends, they say, oh, you know, can you teach us some Fijian? I'll teach them, like, you know, I'll say the basics, you know, hello, bula, and everything. And, you know, my name is, you know, Peniasi and everything. But then when they ask, you know, can you teach us like a full conversation and like how you would go about things? Like I said earlier, you know, that's where I'm hit a brick wall because I can't go any further than that. It's the basics that I'm comfortable with, but it's the more in-depth things that I kind of have to cope with and try and, you know, get to know more, which is not a bad thing because, you know, as I said, we keep on learning, and I want to learn, especially, you know, my dialect, especially. And going back to the home village next year, hopefully, if this all clears up, then, you know, we'll get to really get to know the roots and, you know, our family, especially, because another thing as well with the family, the name of, you know, your name, your surname is, you know, where you stand in the village and your position in the village. And that all comes down to like the land that is in your possession. You know, it's things like that, you know, there's more to it than just the language and who you are. So that's what I think.
So it's like you have a sense of belonging to that particular group. Is that what it is?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
Yeah, so identity really. Okay,
Can I
thank
say
you.
something? I think, like on your question, Anna, I think it's about language, right? How does the language compromise?
Yeah, you know, not speaking in Fijian, not speaking your language.
Not speaking your language.
Yeah, explain the reason why it compromises on your identity.
I think in addition to not speaking, like Peniasi has mentioned, I think even some people, they can speak their Fijian or their dialects very well, but I guess in some situations, they can be made to feel less Fijian by just not being involved.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Sorry, that's very interesting what you said. So they can be made. Who is making them? Like who are?
It's obviously other people in the community. But like to me personally, it's about how you react to it, like how you react to that situation. But we all react differently. Yeah. So there may be or are people who have been made to feel that way, that they are not Fijian enough because they don't get involved in you know, whatever the local community, Fijian local community is doing, or you know, they don't attend gatherings or maybe the church services, because I think it comes from that perspective that we are always very communal, where we're always coming together, sticking together, and if you're not involved in that, then it sort of can make you feel less like. So it's sort of like these kind of questions can sort of make you feel like, oh, I'm not.
Yeah, do you think
psychologically it can play, these thoughts can play at the back of your head when you're in your home and in your own personal space.
Yeah.
These
Do
are
you
things that
think
will
that's
make you feel small, you know, like you're not. But personally, I don't think that way. But I do understand that these are real issues that do affect people.
Yeah. So what do you think we should do as a community to kind of eliminate that so that it doesn't create that kind of feeling? Because it's not a good feeling when people are made to feel like that.
Yes.
So we don't want to encourage that, do we? So do you think it should be just, you know, like we should say, hey, you should learn Fijian so that people don't talk about you, or we should say, don't talk about people who do not speak in Fijian? You know, which one do you think we should do?
I think it's,
You know, do we reinforce?
you can approach it in
the
different
negative,
ways,
or
but
do we
to me,
reinforce?
you have to work on your own personal, like from your own personal mindset, make yourself strong personally, because
No, I'm talking about your view. I'm not talking about you assuming somebody else. Like you, start from you.
yeah.
Like, do you think we should say to the community, hey, you know what? Or to the, you know, if somebody comes into your space, do you agree with this notion? Like somebody who comes to your space and they don't speak in Fijian, and you say to them, you know what, go and learn Fijian, because otherwise you will not be accepted here because you're not part of this community. Or do you say to the community, to the people that speak Fijian, you know what, don't shame her because she doesn't, you know, it's not her fault that she doesn't speak in Fijian. So, you know, let's just, you know, if she you know, she can just sit there, but don't make her feel bad. Do you think we should do that, or do you think we should do the other, the one that you personally?
Personally, if I see people shaming someone, I will speak up. That is me. I will not tolerate it. I will not tolerate someone being made to feel that way. You know, that because we are inclusive culturally, we are inclusive. So, but why do we only do, you know, the inclusiveness in tight circles? So yeah, to me, it really comes down to understanding that your words can hurt people, not just your words, but your actions and your, like Philo said, things that are, you know, what you don't say, your gestures, even your facial expressions can just do things to people in their minds. And so we need to be more considerate, be more compassionate towards others, and let's just stop comparing ourselves to other people. If you speak your dialect very well, that is excellent, but don't expect someone else to be the same as you. You know, there's always room to learn. You can learn a lot from the other person who doesn't speak your own dialect or their own region. There's always, you just have to find a different, like you have to change your mind. I think it comes down to how you process things and how you, but definitely for me, answering your question, Anna, I wouldn't stand for someone being shamed in that way or being made to feel. To me, if that happened to, you know, someone I knew personally or my friends, I'd say, if that's how you feel, then don't get involved in it, because that's how their group is. That's how the community, that's what they entertain. And if you can speak up to them, yes, do it. But if they don't want to change it, then there's really no, I don't think you should be involved in that kind of space.
Yeah, I think at times, I mean, like I take my role seriously as an older member of the community. So I will call it out if it happens, you know, and in a way, in our Fijian way or Itauke way or however way you want to call it. But, you know, we have like a way of addressing things. And I think we should be encouraged to call those things out, because you know, at the end of the day, you don't want to the young ones that are growing up here, the diaspora that we have in Fijian diaspora, you don't want them to be, you don't want to alienate them. You want to include them and
Exactly.
And even if they don't speak our language, they should be included in whatever we do as a community. And I think that should be encouraged.
Mm.
Yeah,
because ultimately, like you guys were saying, like we're all Fijians at the end of the day. So whether or not we speak the language or not, it's down to experience. Like for me and Tiko's situation is much different. How she grew up in a household where Fijian language was the thing in the household. Me, with my dad being in the army, only speaking Fijian to me, but then growing up learning English, it's all just down to experience, and that's what people have to be open about and be mindful of, because, like you're saying, it really can have the effect on people saying like, oh, they're leaving me out because I don't speak Fijian, and then that has a knock-on effect, because then that can then lead to them maybe not teaching their children Fijian, and then not learning about their culture, and then not knowing who they are. And the language we speak is like a special one, and we need to really embrace it, really, not shy people away and tell them, you're not Fijian because you don't speak it. That's not the case. The only reason, we don't speak Fijian is because it's not what we were taught, So to say that someone's not Fijian based on the language is far from correct, I think,
Yeah, I think this inclusivity that that's been mentioned, I think that should be encouraged, and not make language. Like I said, I will not undermine of our Itoke dialect or vernacular, because I think it's important for cultural preservation. But as we live in a society like we do here, as a diaspora community, there shouldn't be any pressure on anyone to feel that they have to speak in Fijian to be identified as a Fijian. So we should really encourage all other values that we have that doesn't cost us anything, like generosity, like what we're doing right now, like sharing information, like being welcoming to people, like we are known to be, as people, Fijian people are known to be friendly, to be happy, and during the games like the rugby, we come together and cheer together, and those are the things, because when we go home, then we have our protocols to our own villages, and we can have those cultural protocols and practices that we can learn, and we have the privilege of having IT, information technology and internet and everything, that we can just connect to those at home. We'll have a more clarity in our identity when we use those tools. And as a community here, as a diaspora, I think we really should be focusing on the values that are so important, like integrity, like, sharing, and just, if anybody needs information about studying, about doing things, about the law, people can call me, things like that. So those are the things that we should encourage. And that's my point. But language is still important. I don't undervalue it at all.
Just
Before we wrap up, please go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to add on. So like, I've never come across anyone that's told me, or I've never heard anyone say, oh, you're not Fijian because you don't know how to speak Fijian. I've never come across it, but here with my dad used to preach in a small Fijian community here at church, and we noticed that he would preach in Fijian, and obviously us youths, some of us wouldn't understand him. And then when on our way back home, he was like, oh, how was my preaching? What did you guys think of it? And we said, you know what, Dad, it was good, thank you, but I think you need to kind of preach it in English as well, so that the youths can understand it as well. I think that's one thing that some of the preachers forget, is that there are young people as well that wouldn't understand what they're saying if they're preaching. And after that, when he would preach, he would also preach in English as well, so that the youths can also understand them, and the rest of the community would do so as well, because that's one thing that we were like, well, we felt like, even though we would understand them, we know that there's other youths that wouldn't understand them. So that's their way of, changing it and encouraging that kind of idea of they have to also think of us youths that are growing up.
Good, thank you.
Tiko. Prince of Wales, Sosi, did you have anything you'd like to share before we round up?
Yeah, I agree with what everyone said, and just for people to be mindful within the community that, that they may do things subconsciously by, like we've talked about community events, sometimes when you go to these community events and people are all sat around drinking grog, you can sit there and no one can speak to you because they're all speaking Fijian. So for people, just be mindful that not everyone around that grog bowl understands Fijian. Mm. And that maybe, people, within the community should think of things like that, just be mindful that, there are people here who may be second generation or the new generation of people who are probably mixed Fijian, and just be mindful that not everyone understands, because many times I've been to many functions where I've sat around the grog bowl and people have just talked and talked and talked in Fijian, even in my own village, and it's something that I've become used to, but it's not something that, not necessarily I'm not comfortable with, but it's just for people just to be a bit mindful of it, because you do feel isolated sometimes, and it does feel, and then when people then do realize that you don't speak Fijian, they then almost become fascinated then when they start speaking to you in English, and then get to know you and then realize there's a story behind you. So yes.
I'd also like to add something. We've been talking about, in terms of shaming, we've been talking a lot about those who don't speak Fijian well being shamed a lot. But I also want to say that, people who do speak Fijian, they can be shamed as well. It can also be the reverse. So yeah. Say, for example, like I think Sosi was just saying, giving that example where he feels isolated when he's around people who are speaking Fijian a lot, or just speaking Fijian, and he's there, possibly the only one who doesn't understand. The shame can go both ways. Mm-hmm. The Fijian people as well, the Fijian speaking, it's okay. They can also sort of, because they probably don't know how to translate what they are saying in English, so they don't feel comfortable doing it. Mm. So that's also something that I think that I wanted to say, that we need to understand as well, that there are people who speak Fijian who are not comfortable in translating that into English as well. I was never comfortable before translating my own dialects into English. It wasn't until very recently when I started my Gems of Naitasiri page, where I actually started to translate things into English, that I became comfortable in, because some English translations don't really capture the essence of what you are saying in the Itoke language or the dialect. Mm-hmm. So it can be very tricky. So some English translations, they dumb down the significance of the Itoke words that you use. So let's also try and see things from that perspective, that maybe people don't know how to translate it into the context where that you will understand. Like some jokes, when it's translated into English, it's not a joke anymore. You know what I mean? So let's just bear that in mind, and that it's not always just a one-way shaming thing, that it can be in both, the other way as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point you raised there, but in my experience, it's usually the other way around. I've never really experienced, because it's usually the English speakers who are more understanding of different languages or of appreciating that languages are spoken. I think it's more the Fijian to the English. I don't know, and probably it's amongst us Fijians. Na viwandi dindo et kuno ba dona bos baba lagi dal. Dren tu na tama. Clar, bate ananda itu sono na vital no ni kan dito ki. Men don renda mak katunin do eval tu no ba matang. Yo you read from the other side. Sorry, from it's usually the English English, even English people, I suppose. When when they make mistakes, when people make mistakes in speaking in Fijian or something like that. Say an English person is trying to speak in Fijian, no, and they make a mistake in the way they pronounce it. I've heard, Fijians laughing at those. But I hear that more than I do in the reverse when Fijians make mistakes. It's usually us Fijians laughing at our own, but not the other people, like outside of our own. So if that makes sense. So I think it's but the thing we're trying to sort out here, it's not like shaming is just an aspect of like that just came up in the conversation. But the essence of what we were talking about is the resilience, the cultural resilience. How do we keep, or build on the resilience, in the face of whatever we face in the society that we live in now. And one of it is language, which I think is very, very important but it has to be a choice. It has to be a choice of the person that is wanting to learn, if they're an adult or if they're young. I think the parents then makes that choice for the child. So, and not, the thing is not to put the pressure on any one of these parties to make them pin it onto their identity, and which can lead to being shamed, or shaming and all those things. So in wrapping up, I'll just say that's the important thing to remember. It's that we are proud of our language, Fijian, or Itoke language, or our own dialects. I think every one of us are proud and we want to preserve it, but it should not be made to put any pressure on anyone or to learn it, and there shouldn't be any fear in us in losing it, because that fear is probably fake. Because when you look at our culture in Fiji, our people, there's so many of us that live in our villages, in our much more than our little population of Fijians here. So there are, the language is going to live, it's going to carry on. And, whatever we do here as a diaspora community, and if it means teaching our young ones to speak in Fijian or keeping the language alive by doing all these exercises that Tiko has come up with, and I think Luisa, you do some language thing, workshop or something. So those kind of things, if we can engage people that are interested, that want it, why not? I think we should encourage those things.
You had a second part to your question. I think it was, what do you consider a Fijian language? Is that the one?
Yeah, I think you answered it. I think, it's our own dialect. So,
I speak my own dialect. So yeah, you're definitely right. Like in terms of definitions, it's always very, we can't pin it down, but I speak my own dialect. And from my understanding is from a young person, I was always taught that it was my dialect and the Bauan dialect. The Bauan was the standard Fijian. But I've learned now that the standard Fijian now is, like Bau is its own dialect, but the standard Fijian is now the new way of speaking Fijian. Like on the fire set, there's these kinds of words that are now being thrown. These are like now becoming standard. So even the standard Fijian is now becoming its own dialect now, like modern Fijian.
I think that's open to debate. To be honest,
open to debate, obviously.
It's opinion at the moment. I don't think it's been made official.
That's what I picked up on. That's what I've read, and it was quite interesting. Like even from the discussions especially from here, I've learned a lot, because Philo had mentioned that she's not comfortable speaking in the Mbawan dialect, which is like the, where usually what we switch to when we speak to people from other provinces, because that's like the more common dialect. She's not comfortable speaking that, but she's more comfortable speaking in her own dialect. So I just wanted to bring that up as well, that, maybe if someone speaks to Philo in the Mbawan dialect and she's not very responsive, let's not automatically assume that she doesn't know how to speak Fijian, that she only naturally speak in English. That
And don't shame her.
There's also Philo's one of Philo's close friends. She's also from she's Welsh, and she's Vasui Netasiri. So she speaks her mother's dialect very well, and then she speaks her Welsh. So when she says Fijian, she speaks in her mother's tongue, like which is the Netasiri dialect. She doesn't speak the Mbawan very well. So that's why I'm always saying, let's learn and let's be more considerate of others. It's not automatically that when people speak in English instead of Fijian, that they don't know Fijian. In the general sense, the Mbawan dialect, maybe they just know their own dialects from their own village and province.
And then I think it's also being able to understand people, well, being able to understand Fijian when it's spoken a Welsh accent, because that's what I struggle with, is when I go to Fiji and I'm trying to speak to people sometimes, and I'll be like, oh, the kata in here, yesterday it was batpata, but, I prefer it to be kata, not batpata. Whereas if I said it in an English accent with a Fijian accent, then it's easier then for me to talk that way, to say like, "Men, this place is hot, eh?" You get accepted that way. So it's all one big acting game, I think. Yes.
Very interesting.
Now we know all your tricks, Sosi.
Absolutely.
Even better with a drink.
It's such an interesting conversation, and I wish you could go on and on and on. But we're now at we're at 10.
Oh, yes.
So I'm unfortunately, we're going to have to bring this conversation to a close, but I think we've ended it on a really beautiful note that, not knowing the language does not negate your identity or your belonging as a Fijian, and that we are all proud of our identity and culture as Fijians. There's no question about that. And also, I guess, that reminder to be a bit more understanding, that not everyone's circumstances are the same, and people's reasons for knowing and not knowing the language or standard Fijian are different, and that we need to be a bit more understanding when it comes to these things, and be more mindful of how our responses or our behaviors are affecting those around us, and may mean a big impact on them coming back to embrace or continue learning their culture or being part of the community or not. So thank you very much to you all, Tiko and Peniasi, Lote and Luisa, Anna and Sosi. I think we all heard it here for the very first time. The Prince of Wales had a power cut for the first time live on the Marama Alliance platform. We're very privileged. Your insight on the topic of language and cultural resilience has just been wonderful, and your willingness to share your story, and it being quite an intimate topic on identity. We're very grateful for your openness to do that. It has been enriching for us. It has debunked some of the stereotypes we have of different age groups. It's answered some of the questions that people have had, and it's also planted some seeds on what can be done for us as individuals, or in our little clubs and associations, the provincial groups, or the all girls, all boys networks. And it's just been inspiring all around. So thank you so much for that, and for allowing us to hear your story and being a part of this conversation. And to the audience listening in, thank you for following the series so far. We have one more session on next week, Tuesday at the same time. And that one will be on identity and duality. And that session will be by Ula, Brittany, and Talatala Nimilote, and Anna Langer Tambua. We're not too sure if Mbumbu Silika will be on that one as well, but we'll keep our fingers crossed. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to all the listeners. It's been so wonderful, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.
Naka.
Naka,
Bye.
mare.